Welcome to this episode of Questions People Ask. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Commins. I commonly hear from patients when they're diagnosed with alpha-gal allergy that they are told not to eat red meat, but given little explanation or guidance beyond that. Some of the questions they have include, what is alpha-gal allergy? How did I get this? Will it go away? Are there medications or treatment? In this episode, we'll cover some of the basics related to alpha-gal allergy, or as I believe it's better labeled, alpha-gal syndrome. In fact, I'll often call it AGS for short. If you've recently been diagnosed with AGS, or perhaps you just want to learn more, you've come to the right place. I've diagnosed thousands of patients with AGS, and I'll tell you what you need to know. Let's start with diagnosis. How does one initially come to suspect AGS could explain their symptoms? Well, the reactions are typically delayed, often 3 to 6 hours after eating beef, pork, lamb, venison, goat, etc., any mammalian meat. As shown here, symptoms can include itchy, red skin, and often these symptoms can happen late at night, even awakening people out of sleep. The reactions can also be inconsistent, so it doesn't happen every time. You might be able to eat red meat without anything happening, and then other times have a severe reaction. These pictures show the characteristic flushing and itching that can occur after eating mammalian meat for patients that have alpha-gal syndrome. In addition to the skin symptoms of itching and redness and hives, many patients report itchy red palms that can be swollen, shown here on the right. In fact, this can often be an early sign of an alpha-gal allergic reaction. Occasionally, patients can have a very limited skin reaction such as this, where it's redness and itching and hives, but isolated to a specific body area. While all of those were skin-based symptoms, patients can also have gastrointestinal distress, such as abdominal cramping and pain, diarrhea. They can also have chest tightness and even shortness of breath with their alpha-gal allergic reactions. But the overarching point is that patients need to have symptoms, and that would then potentially lead to testing. This slide shows various tests that can be run, whether it's an alpha-gal panel or the galactose alpha-1,3 galactose alpha-gal IgE test specifically. But this is the test that essentially confirms alpha-gal syndrome. You need the symptoms and then the test. We have such a problem in the allergy field with false positive testing that we really prefer symptoms to drive the testing. It's almost as if the testing is basically used to confirm what we think we already know from talking to the patient about their symptoms and our suspicion. Using the test without symptoms could lead to a false positive and then a diagnosis that may not even be correct. In this same way, if you have been tested but don't really have symptoms and your test was positive, perhaps out of some panel, whether it's a tick-borne illness panel or allergy panel, then it's not unreasonable to question that diagnosis because the test should really follow from your symptoms. This slide shows a different form of testing, which is common, that of skin testing, but is not performed very much for alpha-gal allergy at this point in time. For AGS, we really prefer the blood test. Skin testing, traditionally for alpha-gal allergy, will have very small, less than 4 millimeters, results on the traditional kind of scratch or prick test, which is shown here on the left. And B there is beef, C is chicken, L is lamb, P is pork, T is turkey. But if you look on the right-hand side of that, this is intradermal testing where a slightly increased concentration of these allergens is placed under the skin. And in that manner, you can get a pattern characteristic of alpha-gal allergy. Again, this is not used routinely to diagnose AGS. The blood test is much more straightforward and offers the added benefit of having a number or a titer that you can follow over time. What is alpha gal? Well, it's shown here chemically and structurally on the bottom left. This are two galactoses hooked in an alpha 1,3 linkage, which creates the short name alpha gal. It's also pretty apparent that alpha gal looks a fair amount like blood group B antigen, and we've often wondered if patients who are B or AB blood type, could they be protected in some way from developing AGS? That work is still ongoing, and it appears that they may have less of a chance of developing AGS, but it certainly can happen, so they're not fully protected. But importantly for this story is the distribution of alpha gal. As humans, we don't have it, but it's present in the tissues and meat of all non-human, non-ape mammals. So pigs, sheep, rabbits, deer, cattle, bison, etc., all have alpha gal. We generally say once you've developed AGS, you only should eat meat from things that fly or swim. Equally, the products from those mammals would also have alpha gal. So cow's milk has alpha gal, so does cheese. And these exposures can give symptoms to some folks who develop AGS. Others can tolerate those products without issue. It turns out that alpha gal syndrome is global, and in each of the areas of the world where significant populations of people with AGS have been reported, there are various species of ticks that are associated with this. And it's different ticks. So in the US, particularly in the southeast, east, and central US, we associate AGS with Lone Star ticks, Amblyomma americanum. In other areas of the world, Australia, for example, AGS is associated with Ixodes holocyclus. In Europe, it's significantly associated with Ixodes ricinus. We'll cover the association of tick bites and alpha gal syndrome in more detail. But for now, it would be important to know that if you've been diagnosed with AGS, that IgE level or titer is associated with the recentness of tick bites, perhaps better phrased as the number of new tick bites, which would be shown here in this graph on the horizontal axis, where increasing number of bites leads to a higher level of alpha gal IgE. This is in particular patients who've been bitten by Amblyomma testinarium ticks, which are more readily found in Asia. But the premise of this seems to be quite true for patients in the US as well who have Lone Star tick bites. Importantly, what we've found over the years is that an avoidance diet and how good you are with that diet is really not the critical part for achieving remission or a lower alpha gal blood test number. That the blood test number itself seems much more correlative to recent tick bites and over long periods of time how well someone does in terms of their tick bite avoidance. That seems to be the critical aspect to getting the blood test number to ultimately go away over time. Let's talk a little bit about alpha gal syndrome reactions. We mentioned this already, that they are delayed, but there tends to be two different types or kinds of patients and experiencing different reactions. The initial I call original, and that means that these were the first patients that led us to describe AGS. They experienced itching, hives, swelling, diarrhea, can have low blood pressure, which will often manifest itself as lightheadedness or dizziness. They can have chest tightness, difficulty breathing. And if you have those types of symptoms, especially in combination, we call that anaphylaxis. That is a severe allergic reaction, the treatment of which is epinephrine. Typically, the symptoms are delayed 3 to 6 hours after the exposure. Now, that can change over time and a little bit between reaction to reaction. But in general, patients with AGS don't have immediate symptoms. We often say that the issue does not occur at the restaurant, but it occurs at home later. Over the years, we eventually came to realize that there were folks with AGS who really didn't have any of the skin or breathing or cardiovascular related symptoms at all. They had only gastrointestinal symptoms. So they would often describe terrible heartburn or the worst abdominal crampy pain they've ever had, and often terrible diarrhea. I've had people describe it as an exorcism, and occasionally some nausea, even vomiting, but they didn't get hives or itching. It was really an isolated gastrointestinal issue. Those people often do not describe the 3 to 6 hour delay. Their symptoms can often be delayed, but tends to be more kind of on that 2 hour time frame. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but we do have times when people are tested for alpha gal IgE by blood test and don't really have symptoms. And then you often wonder, is it the correct diagnosis? Have I been labeled with AGS or diagnosed with AGS, but I don't really have it? And a couple reasons for this. One is there's a high rate of testing positive amongst people who live in tick heavy areas and may have a history of tick bites. And if you test them, they may test positive, but yet they eat beef, pork, lamb, venison, etc., completely fine. And in that scenario, you'd have to say again, well, it's a test that was ordered without symptoms, and therefore it may really be a false positive. Secondly, do symptoms correlate with times of eating red meat? The reactions may not happen every time, but don't think that you have been incorrectly diagnosed with AGS because you can eat a couple of pieces of bacon and nothing happens. But if you eat a hamburger, then you get hives. If you're getting symptoms and have a positive blood test, that makes the diagnosis of AGS. And there may be times where it doesn't happen as consistently. And we realize this, it is an inconsistent type of allergy. And also, another factor in trying to decide if it's the correct diagnosis would be if you've been diagnosed and have done a thorough job removing red meat, perhaps even dairy from your diet, but really don't have much to say in terms of improvement of your symptoms, then you certainly could consider tightening your avoidance diet, meaning you really start to eliminate all forms of dairy, such as cheese and butter, and maybe even gelatin and gummy candy, all of that type of thing. And if you've done that and still no improvement in symptoms, then it is completely reasonable to question whether it's the correct diagnosis. So, assuming AGS is the correct diagnosis for you, what do you avoid eating? Well, the most basic or straightforward portion of the avoidance diet is to take red meat. Again, that would mean any mammalian meat out of your diet. Pork is from a mammal and is part of this avoidance diet. So we remove mammalian meat, especially fatty cuts of mammal meat. It turns out that the fat content can be really important in predicting both reaction consistency and severity. The fattier the meat or the product, often the worse the reactions are. And ice cream is there in parentheses because for patients and people that have alpha gal syndrome, ice cream can be a really bad actor and in some ways almost acts as a mammalian meat, probably because of the high fat content. Many people are okay with dairy and cheese, and we often use symptoms there as the guide. So if you're newly diagnosed and you haven't gotten in front of an allergist and you're avoiding red meat and your symptoms are improved, but you have dairy in your diet, most of the time we keep dairy in the diet and only go based on symptoms. So if dairy's not bothering you, cheese, butter, milk, then often we will just keep dairy in the diet. Gelatin and carrageenan are triggers for some folks with AGS, but I would suggest that it's probably a small fraction that are routinely bothered by gelatin and carrageenan. Gelatin can obviously be derived from pigs and cows. Carrageenan is actually a product of an algae seaweed that isn't mammal at all, but for whatever reason, that product contains alpha gal epitopes. And we've never done a challenge with carrageenan, but certainly have patients who've reacted to it. And it's a thickener, so it can be added to various things such as, like almond milks or oat milks. And some people need to read labels for carrageenan. So it's an uncommon trigger, but one that we're aware of and some people must avoid. The other thing that comes up sometimes is this phrase natural flavors. It turns out that that can mean mammal, but it doesn't always. So some food manufacturers will add natural flavors to their ingredient list and you don't really know what it means, but when folks have called or looked it up, it on occasion means that there's been beef or pork flavor or fat added to that food. So I think if a food consistently bothers you and you don't understand why, maybe read the label and see if natural flavors are there. And that may be an instance where you actually call the manufacturer to ask about it. Some people with AGS report that they are most likely to react to the following byproducts: tallow, suet, or lard. Again, this is totally in keeping with the idea that fatty cuts are worse and the fat content really matters. Whey can bother some people. Vitamin D3, often made from lanolin unless it's vegan. It turns out it can be hard to get a great high quality source of vitamin D3 that isn't mammalian, especially for people who have significantly low vitamin D levels. So certainly something to talk to your providers with or about. Glycerin can be derived from mammals. Some of it is plant-based and really just have to kind of check it as needed. We've talked a lot about what not to eat and what someone with AGS might be allergic to, but what about what can you eat? Well, certainly plants top the list, obviously, except carrageenan, which is a food additive made from red algae. And we discussed that on the prior slide. Secondly, poultry, chicken, turkey, duck, emu, ostrich, etc. The caveat there really is just to be aware that even poultry isn't universally safe. There are times when it may be injected with gelatin or flavored with mammal-based products to enhance the taste or the palatability. And so there can be contamination. Often this is such a small amount that folks aren't even bothered by it. But occasionally we certainly do find patients who report reactions to eating certain brands of chicken. And if that happens to be the case, certainly worth a call to the company to try to understand perhaps more about their process. I would also add to be cautious with chicken or turkey sausage, as these often have particularly pork casing on the outside. I would caution against removing the casing and then just eating the sausage, as the casing is considered an internal organ, and organ meats from mammals can be particularly bad actors. So just be very cautious with sausages that may be labeled chicken or turkey sausage. It's definitely worth asking what the casing is made out of. Then fish and other seafoods, they're generally considered safe. I think the one exception here is that the roe of some flounder have been found to contain alpha gal. Interestingly, the meat of flounder does not seem to contain alpha gal, and people report eating that just fine. There's no current evidence, to my knowledge, that other fish eggs, which are commonly consumed, such as salmon, herring, caviar, contain alpha gal. It's possible because there are some less commonly consumed fish eggs that might contain alpha gal, just in the sense that it has been found in the eggs of other fish. So it may just be that there's not enough consumption of some of these less commonly consumed ones for us to really know at this point. But the main upshot is to avoid consumption of flounder roe if possible. It's important to note that in the US, the term vegan is not regulated by the FDA. So there is no guarantee that a product is mammal free, but we do know that vegan certified products are generally safer for folks with AGS. I alluded to this in some of the prior slides, but I wanted to talk about the four pillars that I think really are important and critical in determining reactions and severity. And we've seen this come up over and over again in our patients with AGS. So, number one is obviously fat content, which I mentioned. The fattier a product or meat, et cetera, is, the more likely you are to get symptoms. And in fact, the more symptoms you are to get. So, it increases both the consistency of the reaction, but also the severity of the reaction as well. Secondly, is dose. So the amount of alpha gal that you eat or ingest or are exposed to is correlated with how much of a reaction you may get. And this deviates a little bit from what you might think about as a traditional kind of food allergy, say cow's milk, egg, or peanut, where even a small exposure can produce really significant symptoms. In the AGS allergy, that can be true, but it's frequently more likely that we find that a small dose produces very few symptoms for most patients. Again, people can be very sensitive and a small amount can bother them, but in general, a small exposure produces fairly limited symptoms, and a larger exposure, such as eating an entire hamburger, can produce more significant symptoms. Thirdly, cofactors. We probably need a better word for these, but the allergy field, particularly in food allergy, has found over the years, and AGS completely supports this, that exercise or exertion and alcohol can make you not only more likely to react, but you can have a more severe reaction. And I think the example I find easiest is pizza. So often people with AGS can have a couple slices of cheese pizza without an issue. Again, that is if they tolerate dairy. And if they do, they may find consistently they can have 2 pieces of cheese pizza. But if they have been for a run or worked out on the farm that day and, got a big sweat and their heart rate was up, there was significant exertion, they may find that those 2 pieces of pizza all of a sudden give them symptoms of a reaction several hours later. And you might wonder, well, why was it different? It's the exertion, the exercise. And particularly for folks who may have, been on a bike ride and had some pizza, maybe had a couple of beers, then they find again that they're much more likely to react to that food. So use caution around exercise, exertion, and alcohol when it comes to exposures that you typically have been okay with. But equally, the flip side of that is to realize that if you've consistently eaten something such as pizza without issue and you've gone for a run, had a beer, and now all of a sudden the pizza gives you issues, it's not that you then have to take the pizza completely and put it on your avoidance list. It's just that you broke through that tolerance because of those cofactors. So, kind of works both ways. The fourth pillar is recent tick bites. Again, dairy is probably a reasonable example where maybe you can have some cream in your coffee, but if you've had recent tick bites, all of a sudden that cream in the coffee can lead to significant gastrointestinal distress. In those scenarios, we often advise folks to pull back a bit on the dairy, let the recentness of the tick bites kind of fade. So maybe it's 4, maybe it's 6 weeks without dairy. And then we often do a sort of a slow reintroduction. And then while we're on it, inconsistency, it's definitely a hallmark of alpha gal syndrome. The reactions are consistently inconsistent and have fooled people into thinking that they don't have this allergy and later go on to have a significant exposure and can then have significant symptoms as well. What about other exposures beyond foods and some of the things that we've discussed? Certainly, medications top the list of non food related exposures that are important for people with alpha gal syndrome. Various medications can certainly have mammalian products in them, and it can be incredibly difficult to know whether the medicine you're taking has an inactive ingredient that is sourced from a mammal. And part of this is because manufacturers don't have to declare where their specific inactive ingredients come from and can change that without additional information, and it's completely legal. So it really can be a challenge to know for medications. Gelatin based plasma expanders, they're not commonly used in the US, if at all, but across the globe, gelatin based plasma expanders are used and can be a readily available source of alpha gal exposure. Vaccines, including those that contain gelatin or other mammalian byproducts, in the US, these can include MMR. We often recommend Priorix now. Tdap can include various exposures. We've had good success with Adacel, and the shingles vaccine, Shinrix, has really been safe for many folks as best we can tell. That one comes up frequently for folks with AGS, so I thought it worth a mention here that has been safe. Antivenom can have alpha gal. I generally tell folks if you're in the emergency department and someone wants to give you antivenom and you have AGS, I would still take the antivenom because it's not 100% a foregone conclusion that you'd necessarily react to it. And if you did, you're in a good spot to get it treated. But I would hesitate for someone to not take antivenom if it were, you know, thought that you needed it by your healthcare provider. I would probably take it. Other products that contain gelatin or can contain gelatin are listed there. I would commend to you alphagalinformation.org and particularly pillclarity.org as additional resources. Pill Clarity, which is the brainchild of Dr. Sachin Shah, is a really trusted resource for physicians, healthcare providers, and pharmacists that are helping patients as well as patients themselves as a site for reliable information related to the sources of various inactive and active ingredients. So they can certainly be really helpful when it comes to trying to figure out whether your medicine might have alpha gal in it or not. Ticks are such a important factor in alpha gal syndrome that I thought it worth spending a few slides on these creatures. This is the Lone Star tick family, if you will. And it's important to keep in mind that the adult female has the white spot that's characteristic of the Lone Star tick, but the males don't. And so there can be confusion about, well, I was bitten by a tick and I don't think it was a Lone Star because there was no white spot. Unfortunately, that could have been a male Lone Star tick. So certainly reasonable to just monitor for the development of symptoms if you're in a particular geographic area and have a characteristic tick bite. I've included this slide to demonstrate that the smallest forms of ticks, the smallest life stages, whether it's larval or sometimes nymphal, can be so incredibly difficult to identify that they can appear no bigger than a poppy seed on a bagel. And often people will call these seed ticks. Others may call them turkey ticks, but they can be no bigger than a freckle and often may not latch on the skin very well. And so it's not uncommon for these small ticks to be either incorrectly identified or perhaps not even for folks to know that they've had a tick bite because the ticks themselves are so small. I just want to make the point that when we ask about tick bites, we don't just mean attached adult ticks. There can be tick bites where the tick is never found attached or perhaps even suspected, as in the next slide. This shows the ankle of a participant who was bitten by numerous larval ticks. And in many instances or settings, this may be reported as chigger bites because the ticks they don't latch well and they often have to be scraped off or duct tape or some other way removed. And certainly with this many bites, the ticks would have been seen, but people could easily have 10 or 15 bites and report them as chigger bites when in fact they could be bites from larval ticks or seed ticks. So just trying to expand the notion of tick bite to include all those life stages and have us think a little more broadly about whether in your history you've had a history of tick bites. I think it's also important to recognize that there is a characteristic response at the site of tick bites from the skin where people often will say that they had a tick bite where there was something different about it and the bite itself, the skin under that bite was red and itchy and inflamed. Perhaps the the lesion or the bite was slow to heal. And this seems to be incredibly characteristic or highly reported of people who go on to develop alpha gal syndrome. I'm sure that there's plenty of people who get these really aggressive skin responses at the site of the tick bite, but it almost feels as though that is kind of the first thing that has to happen before someone goes on to develop AGS. So it's incredibly common that people will say, "Oh yeah, I had a specific bite that was slow to heal and really kind of hung around for a long time." The other thing that people will say sometimes is that the site of their most recent tick bite was the first place that itched during the start of an allergic reaction. And not always do they say that, but if that is you, it's not all that unusual and it's completely in keeping with the alpha gal syndrome. Even though it feels as though we've been talking about tick bites and the development of alpha gal allergy from the beginning, it really wasn't until 2023 that a case control study really established that relationship between the history of a tick bite and alpha gal syndrome. We also learned from this study that a large number of people who were enrolled as controls, meaning they ate red meat and had no issues and no issues with dairy. And we asked them multiple times over about that. And even in those controls, almost 30% of them still had positive blood tests for alpha gal IgE. Now, these participants were enrolled from a county where tick bites are common, but it makes the point that we really want symptoms to drive our testing because there can be a fairly high background or false positive rate, particularly in some areas where tick bites are common. And so we we rely on that symptom or history of reactions first to drive our testing. Some of the questions that people ask about alpha gal syndrome related to ticks are that the bites are not recalled and tick bites are confused. If you talk to healthcare providers in the emergency department, they often will say that patients ascribe any bite to spiders. And in some instances, these are probably tick bites where there is a perhaps the development of that itchy red spot that's slow to heal from the tick being attached, then it's no longer attached and it wasn't seen. And so spiders are implicated. But as I mentioned, that skin response that's red and itchy, slow to heal, is characteristic of alpha gal syndrome. Unfortunately, we don't know the denominator in that. We don't know how many people develop those skin based reactions, if you will, but who don't go on to develop AGS. So that's an important part of the next phase of research, too. I mentioned this earlier, but we have seen over time where recent tick bites can change the allergic response to alpha gal exposures, particularly, I would say, related around dairy, where people may have dairy in their diet and have a tick bite, have an increase in their alpha gal blood test, and their symptoms seem to change. Perhaps they become more sensitive, they can't tolerate the exposure to milk or cheese. But fortunately that seems to wane, and the longer they get in time away from that tick bite, then often the symptoms, the sensitivity kind of resolves and gets back to kind of baseline, so to speak. So, where is the Lone Star tick? Basically, the 1945 limit was shown there in the black line, but we now know in 2022 studies that the distribution of Lone Star ticks includes all of the pale orange, but also now the bright orange areas shown in this map. Probably the Lone Star tick continues to spread based on migration of deer and perhaps birds, etc., moving this tick into new geographic areas as well. So, what do we know about testing for alpha gal allergy? These data shown here depict the increase in the number of folks who were tested and determined to be positive between 2013 and 2018. And you can see a significant expansion of positive individuals beyond kind of the mid southeastern states, but also now by 2018 up into northeastern US and spreading significantly towards the central US as well. Even more recent data from 2017 to 2022 shows the burden of alpha gal syndrome in the southeastern US continues, but now with spread up and down the eastern seaboard and significant encroachment into the central US. There are some dark blue counties around the Great Lakes. Although difficult to see in this map, Long Island is dark blue, and a significant number of testing positive cases come from there as well. So the issue with increasing numbers and testing is underscored by the fact that healthcare providers don't know as much about AGS perhaps as the public does. In a study of healthcare providers in 2022, 42% of those surveyed had not heard of AGS, and only 5% felt very confident in their ability to diagnose or manage patients with AGS. So we have an allergy that is significantly on the rise, affecting several 100,000 folks within the US alone. And we don't have enough awareness and expertise amongst healthcare providers to help our patients that have AGS. Beyond just healthcare providers, the public understanding and awareness of alpha gal syndrome is also lacking. A national survey of a little over 3,500 individuals found that nearly 70% had not heard of alpha gal syndrome or a red meat allergy associated with tick bites. In fact, only 58% identified beef as a mammalian meat. And of those who knew of or had heard about AGS, over half of them reported learning about it from the news, not from their healthcare provider or other source. So, still a fair amount of work to do in terms of raising awareness and helping folks get the word out about alpha gal syndrome. I think it's important to mention that having alpha gal syndrome and other food allergies can create a significant mental health burden. And alpha gal syndrome does affect adults. It is one of the very few food allergies that can absolutely come on in adulthood after someone has safely eaten red meat for 4 or 5 decades. They end up with fresh set of tick bites, and all of a sudden they have a new food allergy. And we know that adults are more likely to report experiencing anxiety around food allergy than kiddos. They're also more likely to report underestimating the severity of their allergies and panic attacks. So I think it's important that we talk about this, that we acknowledge that there is a mental health burden. People with AGS report that they have to live in constant fear and vigilance. Some of them report that eating is no longer a pleasurable or fun experience. It's a social activity that's been taken away. And the lack of labeling can be really difficult as well. So, if you're feeling a heavy mental health burden with your AGS diagnosis, definitely worth talking to your healthcare provider about that. Some of the other burdens of alpha gal syndrome as detailed by Sarah Zhang in this Atlantic article from October of 2024, include farmers who have AGS and report difficulty caring for their animals, needing to sell their farm, soldiers with alpha gal syndrome who have reactions to meals that are ready to eat and include foods to which they are allergic and may not even know. Equally, chefs or restaurateurs who develop AGS and are unable to taste the food that they've prepared, and so they've sold their restaurant. It has many forms that can take in terms of these burdens of alpha gal syndrome, and certainly one of the things that we need to be more vocal about and raise awareness. It goes beyond just food allergy, and as I mentioned at the beginning, probably much better termed as a syndrome. What are some of the ongoing issues that we are researching and talking about with our patients? One of these is the idea of fume based or aerosolized exposures that can lead to symptoms. I use this reference to demonstrate that even in 2000, there was a recognition that certain fish allergens could be aerosolized or perhaps fume based. So there is a precedent that some allergens may be airborne. And if you're experiencing symptoms when people are cooking meat or you're walking by a grill that has red meat on it and you get symptoms, there's probably a precedent for that. And certainly others have reported it. Fortunately, it does not seem to occur commonly or certainly not for everyone. But often people who report fume based reactions tell us that the symptoms happen much more quickly than if they were to eat beef, pork, or lamb, that they feel symptoms within minutes of the airborne based or fume based exposure. Some of the questions people ask about alpha gal syndrome related to prognosis and treatments include how important is tick avoidance? And it's critical. The tick bites are the portion of this that keeps the alpha gal IgE blood test positive. We've had people who keep milk or dairy or cheese in their diet the whole time and their blood test numbers fall. And it's not the food avoidance. The food avoidance is critical for additional episodes and allergic reactions, but it's the tick avoidance that is critical for ultimate resolution of alpha gal syndrome. So any techniques or tricks or things you can do to avoid ticks, those are clearly critical when it comes to reaching the other side of alpha gal syndrome. Epinephrine is the treatment of choice for anaphylaxis, not unusual at all for patients with AGS to have an epi auto-injector or epi nasal spray now, epinephrine in some variety prescribed to them for cases of severe allergic reactions. Gastrochrome we use a lot in my clinic for patients that have significant GI symptoms. And this gastrochrome is a mast cell stabilizer that is not well absorbed. So it really is a GI specific medicine. It's quite well tolerated, has a fairly short half life though, but many folks report that it's quite helpful to them. And finally, Xolair has been recently approved in February of 2024 by the FDA for a food allergy indication. And we have numerous patients on Xolair under that indication who have alpha gal syndrome as well. In conclusion, the way that we believe currently that alpha gal syndrome works mechanistically is that a tick bites a human, and because of alpha gal in the tick saliva, the human immune system creates an allergic response to that alpha gal sugar. And That allergic response then populates all of the allergy cells. And when at the next time beef or pork or lamb or venison is eaten and alpha gal gets consumed, an allergic reaction then ensues. So the bite happens, and then there's probably 3 to 4 to 6 to 8 weeks in between the original bite and the development of the alpha gal allergic response, such that eating the food could trigger it. It doesn't seem to happen overnight. That may be different if you've already developed it and this is like a recurrence, but the first time someone develops alpha gal syndrome, it probably takes weeks after the bite before they could truly have an allergic reaction after eating red meat. One of the things we've learned from the work with Dr. Karim is that the larval forms of these ticks don't have to have already fed on a deer or a dog. We used to think that was true, that the tick had to first have a blood meal of an animal that had alpha gal and almost pick it up, so to speak, from that animal and then transmit it to the human for our immune system to respond. But it really doesn't seem like that's the case anymore. From his work, it seems that the ticks have the ability to create either alpha gal or some very similar sugar in their own saliva. And then when they bite a human, for some reasons we don't yet know, certain people develop the allergic response to alpha gal from the tick's saliva. And then that triggers the development of the allergic reactions the next time, again, a few weeks after that, when red meat or dairy is consumed. And we think it's the fat content that is probably the reason for the delay. So definitely several things in there that we need more time to do research on and demonstrate, but that's the current paradigm. The tick can directly bite a person, and it can be the tiniest forms of ticks that have not had a blood meal from another mammal already. After that tick bite, a few weeks pass, then the person's immune system is ready to respond in an allergic kind of way to red meat. We think over time this resolves, but additional tick bites can certainly continue to keep the alpha gal syndrome present for many folks. That concludes episode 1 of Questions People Ask. Thank you so much for listening. There are certainly more questions people ask about AGS. And for more information on how I manage AGS, check out episode 2. Also, feel free to ask me your questions on Instagram through the Questions People Ask podcast account.